Welcome all of you to the ongoing online Winter Sial Festival at Majha House. Normally, we would have liked to have you there in person, but because that's not possible, we are doing this festival in January online. This is our second session this month and in this brand new year. And today we bring to you an important book on an extremely critical subject by a celebrated author, public intellectual, politician, Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor's new book, The Battle of Belonging, is many books in one, and it deals with the multiple subjects which are related, of course, to each other and are mostly also spelt out in the title itself. Citizenship, nationalism, patriotism, and what it means to be an Indian. And of course, belonging and who belongs and who, for some reason, becomes an outsider, he does not belong to this nation. These are all the plans that are there in the book, and we're going to have a discussion on some of this evening. It's an important book published in November, and 2020 was a year that I think will remain in all our collective memories, etched there as something we have somehow managed to survive. We began with protests at Shaheen Bagh, and then we had riots in Delhi. We ended the year with having gone through a dreadful pandemic, having lost jobs, lost livelihoods, lost people. And we have an ongoing protest of farmers at our doorstep. Our first session this year, what we began with on the 2nd of January, was a session on these protests and on what the farmers are asking for. And we actually focused on Trolley Times, the newspaper that has been started by 4 young people and which is being published in 2 languages and a translation also in English. The questions that Dr. Tharoor raises over here in this book all deal with this whole idea of India, and he puts forward very clearly what he perceives or what he would like India to be, or to go back to being, or what it tried to at least begin with. And maybe we got lost somewhere along the way. His vision, as it says in the book, is that India will be a country where you won't get lynched for the food you eat, marginalized for the faith you profess, criminalized because you love, or you find yourself in prison for exerting your fundamental rights, for protesting or for dissenting. So these are some of the things that we hope India will, I hope we do become that at some point again. Engaging him in conversation this evening, we have Dr. Rakshanda Jalil, award-winning translator, writer, and literary historian. She's published 25 books, and she runs an organization called Hindustani Awaz, which is devoted to popularizing Hindi and Urdu literature and culture. Over to the 2 of you, over to you, Rakshanda, to please take this conversation forward now.
Thank you, Preeti. Always a pleasure to work with Majha House. Dr. Tharoor, I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. This is a fabulous book, a very important book, a very timely book. I read it at a gallop over the past 2 days. I have, of course, a lot of questions, but at the risk of sounding banal, I want to ask 2 very short and somewhat sweeping questions. And if possible, give me an answer in 1 word, please. What do you think is India's greatest strength and greatest weakness, in a word?
Our greatest strength is our diversity and pluralism. Our greatest weakness is our capacity to be divided amongst ourselves.
Right. Okay, so against that backdrop, let's dive right into the book. For those who may not have read the book, I do want to say that this has a fairly wide context. He lays the ground till he comes to his argument, gives examples from world history. We are not the only ones who are like this. There are others who are many times worse, who there are discrimination, differences, so on and so forth. Um, Dr. Tharoor, you've had long innings as an international diplomat. You have spoken up for the world. Coming from there, coming from speaking for the world to becoming a politician in India and speaking for the local and the immediate and the small, how did you, were you struck by the fact that our worlds are shrinking? You say that for your parents' generation, they prided themselves in their cosmopolitanism. And indeed, we looked outwards to the world. There was a sense of brotherhood of nations and so on. And now it's no longer fashionable. If anything, it's cool to be anti-elitist, And everybody wants to talk about the here and the now and the small and the immediate. Why did this happen? And how did...
I think in many ways, Rakshanda, it's sort of been a backlash to the sweep of globalization that dominated our consciousness and the world from roughly 1980 to 2010. I think that globalization's heyday will be seen to have been those 3 decades when everything happened at the same time. Restrictions lifted, global capital flows, the onset of computing and the move towards personal computers, the invention of the internet. Suddenly we're all connected. Instead of writing letters to pen pals that took 3 weeks to reach another country and coming back 3 weeks later, you were in touch with half the world with a click of a mouse. Satellite technology came into existence. You could watch events taking place half a world away on your TV set in real time. Soon enough, of course, that TV set then became your mobile phone. Everyone became a news generator, became so everyone was instantly connected. And in this spirit, there was this heady sense that borders were disappearing, that the world was being tied together literally into that global village of cliche. And in that process, perhaps people became a little too complacent about it. And a backlash might have been inevitable, but it became particularly inevitable around the time of the global economic crisis at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, because what happened then was that people basically said, there are winners and losers, and we happen to be amongst the losers. And there were losers between countries, and there were losers within countries. So in the US, for example, the Wall Street elite, the consumers in the shops, they all did very well, provided, of course, they had an income, and in many cases, their income grew with globalization. But say the working class, the lower middle class, the people who actually expected to live the American dream, looked to having, for example, we have competition, I'm afraid, from various other sound sources. But anyway, so the people are looked to essentially having, if you like, a better job, a bigger home, a larger salary, a bigger car than their parents. They suddenly found they couldn't even earn the kind of salary or have the assured job or the home that their parents could take for granted. And with that, the backlash came, why are we voting for politicians who have exported our jobs to Shanghai? And this situation then created a backlash in the West. In parallel, that would be what I would call the economic backlash. There was in parallel, there was a cultural backlash. And that cultural backlash was with the cosmopolitanism that came along with economic globalization. The sense that the world was everybody's oyster, the fact that people from different backgrounds were able essentially to travel across countries, were able to work with each other, were able to, I'm afraid this will have to stop because we just can't hear each other.
Very distracting. Can you mute everybody?
I'm sorry that the organizers have not been able to just mute the entire audience instead of asking them to mute themselves, because clearly people are not muting themselves.
Well, I have done, but there's some technical glitch with the Zoom today. And I'm trying to, I would request every participant to please, audience, please mute yourself.
All right, well, we'll have one more serious attempt at this. But anyway, coming back to, I've lost my train of thought, but essentially the economic backlash and the cultural backlash compounded by seeing people from different societies, different ethnicities, different linguistic background, different colors of skin, moving into these societies. For example, in many European countries, influx of migrants from the Muslim world, in the case of America, from all over the world, in the case of Britain, from Eastern Europe
yeah.
because of the European Union. And suddenly you find yourself in a position where people are pushing back at that. And the two kinds of resentment, the economic resentment and the cultural resentment, I think fused together around the turn of that first decade of the 21st century. And what we saw then was a complete pushback against globalization, cosmopolitanism, universalism, even multilateralism. For example, the former British Prime Minister Theresa May famously said, if you think you're a citizen of the world, you haven't understood the first thing that citizenship is about. It has to be about a nation, about a place. There's this British journalist, David Goodhart, who wrote a book in which he argued that there is an ongoing battle between the anywheres and the somewheres. The anywheres are people who are comfortable, if you like, in business class lounges anywhere on the planet, who will attend conferences, make speeches, go to Davos, go to Jaipur Lit Fest, find themselves comfortable talking to anybody from anywhere, in any corner of the world. But the somewheres are the people who are rooted in one place, in one geographical area, with people of one ethnicity, possibly sharing a common religion, speaking a common language. And that sense of rootedness is what makes them authentic. And he argued that the battle between the anywheres and the somewheres is being won by the somewheres, the people with a specific set of roots. And we saw this politically in a number of countries, Rukshanda. You saw it, for example, Rukshanda, you saw it with the rise of Erdogan in Turkey. It was the first of these big strongman leaders. Narendra Modi represents the same sort of assertion of authenticity against ruthless cosmopolitanism. Trump in America was the same thing. The Brexit movement in the UK, perhaps the less successful, but very close to the top, people like Marine Le Pen in France, and the Austrians and the Dutch who came second and third in their national elections. So all of these things. Now, why is this relevant to the book is because it gives you a global context for what I imagine we're about to discuss.
Yeah, no, I want to come to the crux of your argument in the book. But before we do that, you've talked at length about the West, about other people and their problems and so on. But we can say there was a defining moment for the West, the war on terror, with Bush saying, if you're not with us, you're against us. Do you see a defining moment for us in India where something, nationalism, which is a woolly, feel-good thing, which is benign, which is inclusive, when did it stop becoming that? When did it become toxic?
In 2014. I mean, I'm sorry I know people are going to say there's a politician's point of view, but that's why it was important to start where we did.
But what led to 2014?
So I would situate the argument in two contexts. So first of all, there is, if you like, a conceptual context, which is that there are various kinds of nationalism in the world. I've described them in the first 100 pages of the book. And I've reduced them essentially to two kinds of nationalism. One is the nationalism anchored in identity, in immutable facts linked to your birth. Territorial nationalism, linguistic nationalism, ethnic nationalism, religious nationalism, the kinds of nationalism that says you're born into something. You're born a German, let's say, up to about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, a German was somebody who was white, Christian, and spoke German. A Frenchman was somebody who was white, Christian, and spoke French, and so on. I mean, the same with a Dane or a Swede. I mean, a very clear, immutable identity emerging from factors of birth. And their national identity came, therefore, from those basic facts. Whereas the second kind of nationalism, most typified by, at that point, the American perception, was what is called civic nationalism, which is not a nationalism of identities, but of constitutions and institutions. And the thing about civic nationalism, therefore, is that it derives from the consent of citizens to participate in a free and democratic society. And it involves liberal democracy, freedom of expression, and so on. And it's a voluntary, it's like people subscribing to join a club. Now, there was always, in the Indian context, a very conscious decision to choose this form of nationalism. Our anti-colonial nationalism was a little more ethnic. We are Indians, they are Firangs, we're driving them out. But once we'd driven them out, our founding fathers and mothers spent 3 years in the Constituent Assembly thrashing out these issues, debating them in detail, and coming up with the Constitution of India we adopted in January 1950. And the Constitution of 1950 specifically addressed this question: what kind of nationalism should we be having? There was actually somebody who stood up and said, look, since Pakistan has been created as a country for India's Muslims, shouldn't we be a country for India's Hindus? And there was an immediate pushback from the others. And what's striking is that so many of our leaders, of course, Gandhiji was not in the Constituent Assembly, but Nehru, Rajendra Prasad, Maulana Azad, Dr. Ambedkar, everybody argued passionately that our freedom struggle was for everybody and the country we create must be for everybody. And so instead of drawing on cultural or linguistic or religious issues, it's a constitution that gives us a civic nationalism that empowers each individual citizen, assures her or him agency as citizens of this country, that safeguards individual rights, and that at the same time privileges representative democracy and liberal institutions. Now, that was resented, challenged, opposed by the people we today loosely describe as the Hindutva movement. For the longest time, there were just 2 or 3% of the electorate. As late as 1984, their flag bearers, the BJP, had only 2 seats in parliament. But something happened. I think, first of all, there were other reasons for disillusionment with the nature of our politics. Second, there was an opportunity for a new political movement as various ideas came up. For example, initially it was the empowerment of the so-called backward classes, the Mandals. Then came the counter pushback from the BJP when Mr. Advani launched his Rath Yatra for the Ram Janmabhoomi temple. And suddenly you have a political ideology rising in India, which advocated a different form of Indianness and therefore a different form of nationhood. Now, this was still fine for a legitimate debate in a liberal democracy. But when they came to power with an absolute majority of their own, unlike in the 1998 to 2004 period, when Vajpayee Saab was really a chairman of 23 parties, he was Prime Minister of India, but he had to accommodate a majority of other parties that didn't share his Hindutva ideology. But from 2014, there was no longer anything to stop them. And so what they did is they made their ideological convictions synonymous with Indian nationhood. And they said those who attack us and disagree with us or dissent from us are actually anti-national. And they have therefore been able to privilege the idea that loyalty to India means accepting that this is principally a country of Hindus. And this is what the book and people like myself continue to fight back against, because we think it betrays the very ethos and logic of the freedom struggle. If we go this way, we are actually buying into the logic of Muhammad Ali Jinnah and of Pakistan, rather than the logic of those who founded and established India as the country that it is.
Yeah. So I'm with you all along, and I follow what you're saying, and you say this very coherently in the book. But help me understand also why this throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Yes, you want one kind of one nation, but this delegitimizing of dissent. It's not just what we're seeing today at the borders of Delhi. I'm not just talking about that, but any form of dissent, the most minor form of dissent. We have ministers who think that secular is a dirty word. So you have coinages such as secular, So why this mocking of things that are good? I know this sounds naive, but why this complete mocking of good values that have defined us as Indians? Multicultural, plural, secular. This is what our films, our cinema, our popular culture celebrated.
Well, you and I may think these are good values. These people don't. And it's very interesting, for example, when I was a kid, and I'm a bit older than you, we used to actually have a thing called entertainment tax. And those would be waived. The entertainment tax would be waived by state governments.
I remember that.
If the movie promoted national integration.
Yes.
Amar Akbar Antony,
yes.
where you've got these 3 kids separated as toddlers and brought up in a Hindu, a Christian, and a Muslim family. These 3, this film was, given an entertainment tax exemption so that people would go and see it because it instilled those kinds of values. So that was very much the idea promoted by that independence generation, that first generation after independence. When they came to power, they wanted to promote those values of inclusion, of celebrating diversity. But for the Hindutva movement, the very diversity and pluralism that in my first answer to you, I said was our strength, they see as a weakness. For them, they say that you must have unity, but they don't actually seek unity, they seek uniformity. What they want, whereas I want a unity of diversities, they want the unity first and foremost, and a minimal amount of diversity will be tolerated under the sort of iron lid of their form of unity. Because they say that the reason that Hindus have been weakened over centuries and millennia is because, in fact, they were not united. Now, my point is, I'm not even disagreeing about the value of unity. As an Indian, and certainly as an Indian in public life, I believe unity is essential if we are to make progress in the world. But it must be a unity based on democracy, on voluntary participation in our institutions and our decisions, on a process of consultation with all stakeholders before major decisions are taken, and one which recognizes and accepts difference. You see, the funny thing is, the Hindutva movement claims to be representing Hindus, but the irony is, I find the Hindutva movement profoundly anti-Hindu in its orientation, because Hinduism, as I've explained in my books, Why I'm a Hindu and the Hindu Way, Hinduism is basically about the acceptance of difference. That was the Hinduism Swami Vivekananda preached, where he said that Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, there is one truth, but the sages call it by different names. That the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which has just as many different rivers, can flow, some straight, some crooked, from different directions into the same sea, so also all ways of worship reach the same divine. If that is the essence of Hindu philosophy, then it shouldn't matter if you choose to worship in a mosque and somebody else in a church and a third person in a synagogue, because ultimately all those forms of worship are reaching the same Brahman. And that Hindu idea is betrayed by those who claim to be advocating the politics of Hindutva, because they are actually promoting something that is a betrayal of Hindu civilization and Hindu philosophy. I would argue that when I'm attacked by the Hindutva ideologues, such as they are, they say Shashi Tharoor writes as if India didn't exist before 1947 and the idea of India is only the idea in the constitution. They say we are a civilizational state. And I say, yes, we are a civilizational state. I have a whole discussion in the book on Indic civilization. But what is that civilization? It has evolved over 4,000 years. It has taken and absorbed so many influences, Islamic, British colonial rule, all these things. And the truth is that in that process, our civilizational tradition has been one of inclusivity, of religious tolerance, of acceptance of difference, of social justice. And in many ways, this is why through our civilization, we forged a society that allowed individuals to flourish without or despite the barriers thrown up from birth. Now, unfortunately, Hindutva is promoting a nationalism that thrives on exclusion, on aggression, on sectarianism, on dividing. It's much more the nationalism that it's akin to the British football hooligan who says, my team is always right, and if you support another team, I'm going to hit you on the head. That is not true nationalism or patriotism. That is hooliganism, and that's what the Hindutva movement is.
Now, if you see Twitter, the most vicious trolls actually have a tricolor next to their name. Their Twitter handles are also Sacha Hindustani, Deshbhakt, and sometimes True Deshbhakt, right? So this appropriation of images, and appropriation of benign, good, again, I'll use the word good images for actually very vicious agenda. How even Hindutva, what is Hindutva? Is the tattva of Hinduism, the essence of Hinduism. And yet it's how words acquire pejorative meaning. Where are we going to go with this? Are we going to leech our vocabulary of all goodness?
It's a very good question. I mean, the fact is that Hindutva has to be understood as literally having nothing to do with Hinduism. It is a purely political ideology that appropriates Hinduism to bigoted ends. I mean, I would argue that whereas Hinduism is a religion, and as a religion, it is the personal concern of those who choose to believe in it or identify themselves with it, Hindutva, as a political ideology, is actually not terribly concerned with religious concerns. In fact, they are actually indifferent to devotion. Hindutva cares about Hinduism only as a marker of identity. Hinduism itself says, worship as you like. Hindutva says, worship in this way, speak this language, revere this God, etc. And what's curious is, whereas Hinduism has always been open to reform and progress time after time after time. It's been reinvented, rethought, reabsorbed, etc., which is why it's flourished for 4,000 years. Hindutva is reactionary and regressive because its roots lie in the racial pride ethos that spawned other ideologies in the 1920s in Europe, in fascism in particular. And it really comes from that ethos. It doesn't come from Hinduism. Savarkar, the man who invented Hindutva as a concept and wrote about it, was basically not a terribly observant Hindu. And he said Hinduism is only a part. I mean, it's simply something which tells us who we are. Hindutva is a political doctrine. And I think you have to understand that when they talk about Hindu pride and as they see it, Indian pride, they have a very distorted view of what India is and who Hindus are. And to my mind, the great strengths of Hinduism that I've celebrated in my writing lend themselves to a liberal, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, flourishing civilization, and have lent themselves to that for many, many years, which is why we can support unity without uniformity and welcome consensus without conformity, and Hindutva as a political doctrine can't. So yes, if you are going to use Hindutva in its literal sense of merely being Hindu-ness, then I'm sorry, you are actually reducing it to a weasel word, because a weasel word is a word that the weasel has sucked out of all meaning. And that Hindutva has nothing to do with what Hinduism means.
You use a very interesting word for Pakistan. You say that they have a subtractive identity, as in, not this, not this, not this. But we too seem to be going there. You are not enough of a national if you don't love the cow enough, or you don't agree enough, or you don't do this enough or that enough. So do we define ourselves by what we don't have or by what we have? So aren't we also going towards that subtractive ideology and subtractive identity?
It's out of this fear that I brought all those trolls down upon myself by saying that I didn't.
And the numbers are going to multiply after tonight.
But when I said before the 2019 elections that I'm afraid that if we re-elect the BJP, this country will become a Hindu Pakistan and we must fight against that. It's precisely for the reason that you mentioned, Rakshanda. I think we're in the process of actually emulating what they're all about. They have decided that Muslims are a separate nation, a logic we never accepted. They have decided to argue passionately that they're not India, whereas we have never seen it necessary to define ourselves in relation to who we are not. In fact, it's we are this and we are also this and we are also that and we are also this. That was the strength of India, that we could celebrate the fact that that whether you are discussing Indianness and your nationhood in Punjabi or in Malayalam, whether you're a Brahmin or a Dalit, whether you're a Manipuri or a Malayali, whether you're a Muslim or a Hindu, ultimately none of that mattered as long as you took shelter under that wonderful embracing carapace of Indianness. That idea of nationhood, which of course under the Constitution embraces things like freedom of worship, freedom of opinion, freedom of speech, freedom to profess and propagate your religion, minority rights, equality of all citizens, all that that we celebrate is part of what we could take for granted as who we are. Certainly my generation took it for granted. My parents came out of that independence generation. They never once mentioned the religious or caste identity of any one of the numerous friends who came home to play, attended birthday parties, etc. And it was only years later, as one became conscious of these things, that I realized what an eclectic mix of friends I'd had. Because in my school in Bombay, as it then was, yes, my classmates were Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Parsi, even Jewish, as well as Hindu. And I really couldn't tell the difference. I mean, if I ever thought that my friend Muhammad Kanga was a minority, I only thought of him as belonging to the minority of the very rich, because he was one of the first people in Bombay to have a cassette player in his Fiat. That was the sort of, that was the kind of way in which kids thought. We didn't say that the religious identity is what demarcates our friendship with them for who they are. I mean, the truth is that this is the kind of thinking that has come in partly because of politics, which actually goes back to your earlier question, because politics is about the contention to divide resources in a resource-scarce society. And so everyone is saying, power for us, goodies for ourselves, benefits from the state for us. And if you don't have enough, it's because the other guys have taken it. Therefore, demonize the other. That's part of where politics is culpable in bringing us to this sorry past we're in.
Yeah. Now, I love the bits in the book where you talk about your experiences, you talk about the world, you give examples, you talk of, like what's happening in China, for example. I love that incident of the Swedes standing on the railway station. I thought that was really funny. Now, when you look at the world, do you see an example of good nationalism? I'm sorry, I'm kind of obsessed with the word good tonight. It keeps coming into my head for some reason. But can you think of something which has worked for other people, where it's benign, it's healthy, it's tolerant, and yet there is a sense of nation, of being a nation, of being a people?
Well, I've given that example, I believe, in the book, and if not, then certainly in an earlier book, because it's an example I've been obsessed with for 40 years. And that's what happened in the 71 war, when the Pakistani generals, drunk with their power and their bigotry, declared a jihad against a Hindu infidel. And who clobbered them in the war? An army headed by a Parsi, General Manekshaw, whose northern sector in the Air Force was commanded by a Muslim, Air Marshal, later Air Chief Marshal Latif, whose GOC in the Eastern Command was General Jasjit Singh Arora, a Sikh, and where the Major General helicoptered into Dhaka to negotiate the surrender of the Pakistani forces was Jewish, Major General Jacob. Now that is, if you like, good nationalism. They're all Indians. They're serving the cause of this country that they all feel an equal stake in, that they all belong to, they're all proud of, and the whole country is proud of all of them. That's the kind of good nationalism that I'm celebrating in the book, but which doesn't sadly apply, say, in a country like Pakistan, where to be a commander of the armed forces, you have to be Muslim. To be president or prime minister, you have to be Muslim. Whereas in the Hindutva world, how will they accommodate this ultimate reality that we are a country where everyone should have and does have an equal sense of belonging and ownership of the stakes in this society?
Are you envious of any one country where you think they've got it right?
Well, it's difficult to be envious today of any land, because everyone in their own way is struggling with some of these issues. I'm afraid if you'd asked me maybe 5-10 years ago, I would have said that broadly speaking, the US has it right, because literally—
Not today, not after last night.
I was going to say, literally anyone can go to the US once they're admitted legally. They can go to the US, they may not be white, they may not be Christian, they may not even speak very good English, they may not be educated in an American university, but once they've got that citizenship, they have the right to participate equally on an equal basis with somebody whose parents came over in the Mayflower, and they could therefore have as much of a stake and as much of a say in determining the direction of America. Now, of course, after what we've seen in the last few years with the rise of Trump, the forces of bigotry, xenophobia, and viciousness that he has unleashed, culminating in the tragic farce of yesterday. Obviously, with that, it's difficult for us to say that about the US anymore. Many of the European countries are going through their own struggles. I love France, think very highly of it, but look at them with their huge problems in digesting their Muslim minority, mainly from North Africa, or the Germans with their Turkish minority. I mean, pretty much every country in Europe is going through versions of its own struggles. So I don't know whether one can look with envy anywhere. The Australians were actually quite nasty till the 60s, when they had a white Australia policy and only whites could migrate there. Today, they may be, the Australians and the New Zealanders may be the best and closest approximation. But again, they haven't been fully tested because they're still overwhelmingly white Anglophone countries. Will they ever become, shall we say, sufficiently invaded by people who are not like the dominant majority to be able to truly show themselves as exemplars without undergoing major strains? The one country that so far is doing well on that is Canada. In Canada, as you know, since we are in a Punjabi forum, let me point out that our friend Justin Trudeau, perhaps not very tactfully, made a statement that he had more Sikhs in his cabinet than Narendra Modi did. And that's true. He had 4 and Narendra Modi only had 2. And of course, Narendra Modi's lost one of them already now, thanks to the farmers' issue. So let's say that
Yeah.
There is a way in which one can say that it is being attempted. Countries have got greater or lesser degree of success towards it, but I would say India was probably the best example of a successful management of diversity in the world, and certainly in the developing world, until 2014 came along and wrecked it.
Yeah. So somewhere towards the middle of the book, from section 3 onwards, you start talking about the Hindutva idea of India, you talk about the ongoing battle, and you talk at great length about the anxiety of nationhood and so on. Now, we seem to be on the cusp of looking down into a deep, dark space. The raven is looking back at us. Can we step back? Can we reclaim some of the lost ground? Does that seem possible?
Well, if I didn't have the lingering hope it's possible, I wouldn't have invested so much time and energy writing this book, because I genuinely wanted to be a wake-up call for a lot of people who, for whatever reason, may not have thought through clearly the fundamental implications of what's happening to our country. And what we are seeing is nothing short of a complete remaking of what India is all about. If the very basic notion of Indian nationhood, of what is patriotic and what is anti-national, can be recast in terms that suit the Hindutva agenda, we will simply cease to be the India that Mahatma Gandhi fought to free. And I think it's important that we fight to take back India for those of us who actually value our pluralism, value the celebration of all that we have. And to my mind, this book is a contribution which I realize must be mirrored in much greater public education at the grassroots levels. But I do believe that the majority of Indians are not naturally bigoted, are not naturally inclined towards the exclusionary promotion of hatred that we are seeing with the Hindutva movement. Yes, Hindutva has successfully exploited fear of the other. They have won 2 elections in a row, but they won with 37% of the vote last time and 31% the previous time. So I think it's important to understand that though they have a commanding parliamentary majority, they are still finding it necessary to work overtime to suppress dissenting voices because they are not themselves sure whether they have actually captured the hearts of a majority of this country with their hateful rhetoric and exclusionary beliefs. So I think there's enough of a base there for people like us to talk to them, explain why they need to rethink this, and certainly I know it can't be done through an elite book written for an English-speaking audience. The book has just come out in Malayalam in my state of Kerala. It's being translated into Hindi even as we speak. I hope other language publishers will take it up. And I hope that audiences in many parts of the country will have an opportunity to engage with the substance of these ideas. Yes, some things they may not agree with. That's the entire principle of debate that is at the heart of my form of nationalism and liberal democracy. But if they at least understand why it's important for all of us to celebrate what we have, rather than destroy ourselves in the way that this government is seeking to do by reducing us to something much less than what we were, then I think something will have been achieved by this book.
Okay, so to put bluntly, the other side has these stormtroopers of hate. They have a whole social media department, cell, call it what you will. What is the other side, for want of a better word? What do people like us have? Do we use the same weapons, the same tools, the same strategies, or we devise something else?
No, I think certainly we have to use social media and so on. We don't have to use it the same way as they use it. I don't think trolling is a particularly attractive form of human behavior. So I would like very much for us to use some of the same instruments, whether it's social media, whether it's WhatsApp and so on, to try and get out a more positive message to compensate for the negative. Equally, I think we have to stand up against the concerted effort to erode secularism, diversity, pluralism, and replace it with a sectarian way of being, which is what they're trying to do. I would say that we should remind people through stories like the ones that I mentioned about 71 and the other stories in the book, that India embodies tolerance and pluralism in its very essence, and that it's un-Indian to deny these things. You know, I mean, I have to say that when I think of so many opportunities that we should seize, I kick myself that I left out a story that has always meant a lot to me, And that somehow when I was writing this book, at that time, it didn't occur to me because I read another story that I put in instead, also from the army. And that's the story I didn't use, the story of Brigadier Osman. Can you imagine, just in the wake of partition, this brilliant young officer, one of the youngest, in fact, the youngest brigadier in the Indian Army at the age of 38, invited personally by Muhammad Ali Jinnah to come and be the senior most Pakistani officer, declines and stays on to serve the Indian Army. This is a man who gives away all his salary to charity. He's just one of these incredible human beings. And he finds himself on the front lines in a very important action in the war against Pakistan over Kashmir. And at the age of 38, with an incredibly promising future ahead of him, he is killed. And he dies for his country. Now, where does a martyr, a great hero, a posthumous Paramveer Chakra, Mahavir Chakra, like Brigadier Osman, fit into the Hindutva demonology? Where does Corporal Abdul Hamid, who helped capture the Haji Pir Pass in '65, where do the heroes? I've told a different story because I thought that story was a very interesting one about the Pakistani officer who essentially commands the killing of his younger brother, who's an Indian officer. And because of that, I forgot to mention the other story. But I would say that the stories that we can tell our people. I remember I made a speech once at a university, and later for a couple of years, I found a short snippet from that going around and round on social media, though I had not done anything to promote it. And that was a very simple story of how I went to Diu, to the island, where there is a memorial to this ship INS Kukri that was sunk by the Pakistanis in the '71 war. And in that memorial, Captain Mullah from Kashmir was the captain of the ship. He went down with the ship. And the name of every Indian Jawan on that ship is memorialized. And you just go through the names, and there is not one region of the country or one religion of India that is unrepresented amongst those who gave their lives for India on the INS Kukri. And I said, when saying that, I said to the students in the audience, don't let anyone tell you you have no right to belong to this country. This country belongs to you and you belong to it, and no one can take that away from you. Whatever your faith, whatever mother tongue you speak, whichever part of the country you're from, India is yours. And that message is something that I cherish. It's very important. I mean, why should a Malayali Christian or a Meghalaya Christian or a Kashmiri Muslim or a person of any sense of being on the periphery or being a minority either religiously or linguistically or ethnically or whatever, why should such a person want to celebrate Indianness? Because that person has so far been told by the Constitution and by every ruling party since then that you have as many rights as I do, that you have as much of a stake in the success of the society as I do. I may be a Pandit or a Brahmin or a Hindi speaker or an MP from UP, and I may be Prime Minister, but you, that Malayali Christian, that Meghalaya native, that Punjabi, that Kashmiri, you have the same rights, the same authority, the same stakes in the society as I have. That message should be constantly drilled into all our people. And I really fear that we are in the thrall and the grip of a bunch of people who unfortunately do not understand the value of that message and instead are privileging something exclusionary, narrow-minded and bigoted that can permanently damage what India is all about and can damage Indianness. In addition to their own incompetence at managing the government and the economy, which has also driven people out of India, there might be a secession of the mind and of the heart, which will be 10 times worse.
Yeah. So this is a dense book. It's a book rich in detail. There are many things that we've not been able to cover today. I'm mindful of the time. I have used up the 45 minutes we had for the conversation. I understand you have another meeting to go to. We have just about 15 minutes left. Dr. Tharoor, I'm going to quickly look at the comments and the questions that are coming. But while I do that, is there something that you want to talk about that we've not been able to touch in this conversation?
No, I think you've covered many of the key issues that I would have liked to have brought to people's attention.
Give me a minute while I look at the questions.
While you're skimming that, I can just say something to the audience, which is, we've seen a lot in recent times. For example, the silly controversy over the Tanishq ad is something that comes to mind, which showed once again how reactionary and bigoted certain right-wing fringe elements have become. Even as the ruling dispensation was quick to distance itself from it, even the Home Minister, no less, condemned what was done on the Tanishq thing. But let us not forget that this is a Frankenstein's monster that they have created. So even when people in the ruling party or the government denounce some of the excesses, whether it's the Tanishq episode, whether it's some really egregious assaults on Dalits, whether it's cow vigilantism ran amok, etc., we have to realize that they have created this monster. They have sustained it through organized and financed social media trolling groups. The viciousness is paid for and put to the service of electoral victory. And it's one more reminder of the appalling power of the full-throated communal hatred that is so easily unleashed in today's India. As I've said, if such people are so infuriated by Hindu-Muslim ekta, or ekatvam as the Tanishq ad had it, India itself is the world's longest surviving symbol of this kind of ekatvam, the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb that everyone talks about. Petty prejudice can exist in any society.
Right.
What troubles me about the present is that our national leaders, who should be models for the country to follow, don't appear to be in control of the hatred they themselves have created and enabled. And in letting things like this Tanishq thing loose, they're allowing the haters, the trolls, the cynical and opportunistic TV anchors, the vigilantes on the streets, all of them to take us to a very dark place indeed.
Right. So there is a question from Murari Prasad while he compliments your book. He's saying when you talk of, you make your plea on civic nationalism, you seem to be endorsing Nehruvian secularism, which I think has run into difficulties. And then he goes on to say, do you think Gandhi's view on religion melded with secularism might work better, not secular fundamentalism?
No, but that really has been the practice. Nehruji, bless his soul, was himself an agnostic. For him, religion did not matter, but that's simply not true of the bulk of Congress leaders, even during his time and certainly after him. Secularism in India became not about being distant from religion, which Nehruji in his personal life may have been, but rather about allowing all religions to flourish and a profusion of religious expression to take place thereafter. And the honest truth is that we've seen this for many, many years. No one actually clamped down on religion, even under Congress rule. We distorted the meaning of the word secularism, which in the dictionary does involve distancing from religion. And even Indira Gandhi, who inserted the word formally into the constitution, something the BJP keeps reminding us was not there in 47. The fact is that Indira Gandhi herself did start going to temples later in life and was known to have developed religious and spiritual interests. So the truth is that secularism as a term has become a red flag that the Hindutva movement likes to wave. But in practice, what Gandhiji did, which was to actually allow and celebrate all religions, for example, his morning prayer meetings, he had bhajans and psalms and hymns and verses from the Quran and all that, all being read. And then his favorite bhajan was Raghupati Raghava Raja Ram Ishwara Allah Tero Naam. Would the BJP be prepared to accept that kind of Gandhianism as their interpretation of secularism? They would not.
Yeah.
The truth is that they now are talking about taking the word secular out of the constitution. My answer, frankly, is let them. Because even if they take the word secularism out, it is still a secular constitution. After all, freedom to worship and to profess and propagate your own religion and to be equal to anyone belonging to the majority religion, all that's part of the basic structure of the constitution.
But not freedom to love anymore, not in UP.
Well, but that I think will be found unconstitutional by the courts. I'll be very surprised if that's upheld, because that's an awful law that combines not only patriarchy and misogyny, but also religious bigotry all in one package.
Yes.
It's an attempt to restrict the autonomy of women as well as to take a swipe at the Muslim minority. So I think that's going to be challenged. It is being challenged.
Yeah. The other thing that's coming up is this business of tolerance. And Murari Prasad is saying this and others too, that tolerance has no legal teeth. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's interesting. In my own writings about Hinduism, I've actually gone beyond tolerance. I think that tolerance, we're all taught it's a virtue, it's a very good thing. A tolerant king, for example, in our history books, is a good guy because he allowed you to have a different belief, a different God from him, and so on. But the fact is that tolerance is essentially a very patronizing idea.
Yeah.
The tolerant king is saying, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in the right to be wrong. Whereas acceptance is what Swami Vivekananda preached. And acceptance says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, you please respect my truth. And that, to my mind, that spirit of acceptance, of mutual respect, that is what it is the duty of the state to preserve and to promote. Tolerance itself puts somebody on top, in this case, the Hindutva movement. Yes, we are naturally Hindu, this is a Hindu country, it's about Hindutva, but we will tolerate you being a Muslim or a Christian or whatever, so long as you call yourself a Hindu Mohammedan and a Hindu Christian, and you make sure your allegiance is to us and our heroes are your heroes.
And you wear your nationalism on your sleeve to keep it on display at all times.
But it means that, for example, you have to say Bharat Mata Ki Jai, which is their definition of a litmus test, whereas you may prefer to say Jai Hind or Jai Bharat, but you may not say Bharat Mata Ki Jai if you have a set of beliefs that don't allow you to materialize and deify your nation as a goddess. Now, to my mind, the Constitution gives you the right to say or not to say. The Constitution gives you the right to be silent. But for these people, there are so many litmus tests that have come in. So I want to move beyond discussions of tolerance. I don't want to give anybody the right to tolerate me. Right. I want to tell them, you accept me the way I am, and I'll accept you the way you are. And we will, as long as we don't harm each other, we will both live together under this wonderful shelter of the Indian Tiranga.
Yeah, living together peacefully, living together separately. Okay, so there's a question from Sarbjot Behel. Why does the idea of belonging have to essentially revolve around political construct of making it a synonym of nationalism?
No, I use belonging, frankly, as a term because, I go on at some length about patriotism as an issue because, to my mind, one of the important ideas about patriotism is that it essentially says that in my view, it's like loving your country the way you love your mother, for example. It's you love your country because you belong to it and it belongs to you, not because you think it's perfect, not because you want it to win against its neighbors or to push anyone else around or anything, simply because it's yours. And in a large, diverse country like India, our patriotism actually often consists of very many local patriotisms. The sounds, the smells, the sights, the languages, the foods, the clothes, the cultural practices of each corner of India are the first thing that many people think about when they think of their country. And they collectively form our allegiance, our sense of belonging to the larger entity that is India. So that patriotism is what I celebrate when I use the term belonging. Nationalism is often much more linked to aggressive ideas, to statehood, to governments, to armies, and often, frankly, to putting others down.
Yeah.
I've written in the book that a patriot, by and large, is willing to die for his country, but a nationalist is willing to kill for his state. And that is a distinction that I think is not merely a semantic one, as some people like to claim. It is also a very important conceptual one and a difference at the heart.
Yeah. There's a very interesting question from Arpita Chaudhary. She says, how as young citizens of this country, we can avoid manipulation in a time where people who are working for something which actually directly contributes towards the society are scorned at. I think she's talking about peer pressure to conform, to be cut from the same cloth. How does a young person deal with that? And scorning and othering truly are problems.
Yeah, it's a very good question to which there is no easy answer because it essentially calls upon each young person as an individual to find within themselves the strength of character and the strength of conviction to be themselves. I often say, I'm often asked to address high school seniors who are leaving or even graduating college undergraduates. And when I'm asked a question like this, my answer to them is the best thing to do, what you find out about yourself during school and college is who you are, what matters to you, what you're good at, and then spend your life being the best you that you can possibly be. Because nobody else can be you. Nobody else can be better at being you than you can. So take that space for yourself, develop what you are to be the best you that you can possibly be. And that ultimately is what will best serve the country too. And I don't think there's a single person in this country without some individual talent or quality that is of value to the rest of society. It could not necessarily be the talent to come first in class or to win the 100-meter dash or captain the cricket team, but it could simply be a talent to offer a comforting shoulder to a friend in distress. It could be a talent to make someone laugh. It could be a talent to cheer people up in depression. I mean, every one of our talents makes us who we are and defines our place on this planet. So if every young person developed that faith in themselves and a realistic appreciation of themselves, they won't let others push them around. Certainly, allowing others to define you to yourself and to the world is the worst admission of defeat possible in life.
Right. I'm mindful.
Never let others define you.
Yeah, I'm aware you have another appointment, but there are two very interesting questions. We do have time for that. It's just about 1858, so we can keep this brief and we can take these two questions. Anup Vajpayee is asking, the proponents of fanatic Hindutva claim that they have been wronged by history. Is it a delusion?
I would say that it is very much a reflection of the chip on the shoulder that they have been carrying for the longest time. The Hindutva view of history, very simply, is that India was this perfect, pristine, idealized Hindu land, which was then invaded by evil Muslims from the northwest, who subjugated us, oppressed us. And then the British came and subjugated us, oppressed us, colonized us in our minds, drained us and looted us. The latter part, by the way, is true. And then at the end of all of that, we have finally, as they see it, won back our freedom, and we want to undo all these thousands of years of oppression and subjugation. Now, this is a false and distorted view of Indian history because it actually fails to see how in Indic civilization, as I describe it in the book, has had so many influences over so many hundreds and thousands of years from different parts of the world, which have actually gone to making us the extraordinarily rich and diverse people we are, and where even the story of these other influences is more complex than the Hindutva movement imagines. I come from Kerala, where we welcomed the first Jewish refugees on the planet. And it is said that when St. Thomas of the Bible came to preach Christianity, that he was welcomed on shore in Kerala by a flute-playing Jewish girl. And there are stories, for example, of how Islam came to Kerala, which was in the lifetime of the Prophet, because Kerala had been trading with what is today the Arab world for hundreds of years before Islam was born. And so the message came of this new doctrine being preached by this new prophet, and it captured the imagination of some people, including a local king who said, I want to meet this prophet, and he hopped on a ship and went off to the peninsula. Stories have it that he did meet the prophet. He died there and never made it back, but the evidence of his visit still persists today in the Kerala coconut trees growing on the coast of Oman, south of Muscat, on the peninsula to which they're not native. And therefore, the oldest mosque in the world outside the Middle East happens to be in Kerala, because in the 7th century, some character showed up and asked the local Raja, listen, we have a religion, we want to be able to worship. And he said, yeah, there's a disused temple there, hardly anyone goes there, you can have that temple for yourself. And if you walk into that temple, of course, it's been renovated dozens of times in hundreds of years, so it no longer looks like it must have done then, but there still is a gigantic Hindu lamp right at the entrance to the mosque in Kodungalur. Now, this kind of experience of history is very different from the experience that these Hindutva chip-on-the-shoulder warriors are talking about. You meet a Kerala Muslim, 99% of them do not have a sense of belonging to a minority. In Kerala, they see themselves as no different from a Kerala Christian or a Kerala Hindu. Our big festival, Onam, which is like a Diwali or a Christmas combined, is celebrated equally by people of all faiths. And you see this when you are living abroad, for example. These various Malayali Samajams are celebrating Onam. And sometimes there'll be Muslims in the lead, sometimes there'll be Christians in the lead. For them, there is no sense that this is a Hindu festival. On the contrary, it's a Kerala festival. And that celebration is what it's all about. Now, that kind of experience of history varies in different parts of our country. Why would you expect an Assamese proud of his Ahom kings and their independence to nurture any grudge about whether Prithviraj Chauhan was betrayed and lost to the Mughals. I mean, the fact is that this is a political doctrine anchored very, very narrowly on a certain segment of historical memory, animated by the slogan Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan. India is much bigger than any of those three elements. And I think it's that bigness we must stand for and fight for and defend. And my answer to Mr. Bajpai then is that this is indeed a delusion. It's a very partial misreading of Indian history. And therefore, if they feel they have been wronged, what they need to do is educate themselves better. I've tried to do this in some of my books, whether it's Era of Darkness, whether it's Why I'm a Hindu, or even whether it's this particular book. But at the end of the day, there is this old saying that you cannot wake a man who is pretending to sleep.
Yeah.
No one who doesn't want to hear you will hear you. And therefore, it's perhaps not going to be easy to convert some of these wrong-headed people to a bigger, broader, and more accurate understanding of their own past and their own history.
Yeah.
But we should try.
And there are also lessons to be learned from a state like Punjab, the most scarred by the partition. There was blood everywhere, and the sixth river ran through that state, the river of blood. And yet Punjab today has chosen to rise from all of that, put it behind. So it's what you do with the history that comes to you, whether you transcend it or you allow it to kind of become toxic. One last question from Sanjoy Hazarika. He's saying, do speak a little about the end of the Trumpian dystopian disaster. I realize this is not about your book, but it is useful for us to talk about this. And the use of words like domestic terrorism, sedition, and insurrection, and him being banned from FB and Twitter, and the lessons for the rest of the world. Too little, Sanjay, too late, you think?
No, I think it is definitely too little, too late, but it's at least it's happened.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, Sanjoy is a former journalist and a human rights advocate, so I'm delighted to hear from him. Didn't realize he was in the audience. But I will say that his question about the US is certainly a very belated waking up, it seems to me, to the toxins that Mr. Trump and the people he represented had injected into the American body politic. And it's difficult not to escape some cynicism about the banning from Facebook and Twitter. It's not even banning, it's suspension. They've suspended him indefinitely. They've not banned him for the rest of his life. Indefinite could be 2 weeks. It could be 10 years, but it's a suspension. And I would say that one feels a bit cynical because don't forget Facebook and Twitter and so on know very well that after the election results in the Georgia Senate 2 days ago, that now the committees in the Senate that oversee them will be chaired by Democrats. So Trump has therefore suddenly become a much easier target for them than when he and his supporters, were in power and were in a position to call the shots. So I don't know, Sanjoy, that there is any great dawning of wisdom, of acceptance, of enlightenment and liberal values. I think there is a certain amount of self-preservation and that kind of instinct behind the actions of Facebook and Twitter. I hope I'm wrong. I may be too cynical, but cynicism has been bred in us by the events around the world in the last 10 years. The Trumpists who have inflicted their trumpery on America did themselves a great deal of damage with their misbehavior on Capitol Hill. But the fact is that all along, their behavior reflected their failure to respect or legitimize the other side, their disregard for something as basic as truth. I mean, when you say that the only election result you will accept is a result in which you win, what is that? I mean, it is literally an alternative reality that you inhabit. I hope that we in India will never get to that point. So far as people point out to those of us hapless beings who are in the opposition, they do point out the BJP has no interest in subverting elections because they win them. And fair enough, I'm willing to take that point so far. But the day will come when they will cease to win them, and I hope they will show more respect for the Indian voters and the Indian electorate than Mr. Trump and his Trumpists were able to show to the American electorate and the American system. But in the end, don't forget, every democracy is as fragile as the custodians entrusted with it allow it to be. And if those who are in charge of democracy show respect for it, it can be strengthened. I mean, we all are critics. I've been a published critic at that time of Mrs. Gandhi's emergency. But when she lost the election of 77, she gave power up. And that ultimately, that respect for systems, rules, institutions, procedures is what will sustain us. Every time a government of India has lost an election, it has handed over power with respect for the other side. And I believe that if we can continue in that spirit and never descend to the levels of the Trumpists, then I think we would be able to send some reassurance to Sanjoy Hazarika and others who have these concerns.
Yes. So let's conclude with the hope that we will not see lumpens taking over our seats of governance, and we will not be presented with these sorry sights. It was a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Tharoor. There is still so much to ask and talk about, but I see we've run out of time. Thank you very much. Over to you, Preeti, for your concluding remarks.
And thank you, Dr. Jalil. I must say
Thank you very much.
that you are a terrific interlocutor. Another word that I've been trolled for, but
yes.
It's absolutely the right
Well,
Thank
I
you.
must say it was a beautiful, insightful talk and a beautiful example of the secularism. And I would just wind up by saying कि लोग अक्सर मुझे तुम्हारे नाम से पहचान लेते हैं. Now this I'm talking about India, Hindustan. लोग अक्सर मुझे तुम्हारे नाम से पहचान लेते हैं. मैं वो खोई हुई चीज हूँ जिसका पता तुम हो. So thank you so very much, Dr. Shashi and Dr. Rakshanda. Like in the Winter Festival, we have a couple of events coming up. Tomorrow we have the Lost Homestead by Marina and Anchal, and day after it's a Radiance of Thousand Suns by Manreed Sori and Kiran Manwal. So please stay in touch with Majha House, and thank you, Dr. Shashi, for being with us and beautiful session, Majha House, and we welcome you to Amritsar wherever the things are good. So please do visit us.
I would love to come. I love your city. I've been there a few times, and I look forward to discovering Majha House, the place, and not just the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you.